take me back to year one. You stepped away from your firm, fully committed to being home with your son and expecting to feel exhilarated and full of life and reset. What actually happened, and what was the moment you realized dads were almost completely invisible in the parenting conversation?
That is exactly what happened. I had been working, idealistically started my own firm right out of college and really wanted to make a positive change in the world. And then we struggled to get pregnant for years. And then when we finally did get pregnant, I had given so much to my partner and so much effort and struggles in trying to achieve this goal of getting pregnant that I was kind of an empty shell. And I looked to my community when we got home from the hospital, and it was like a ghost town. It wasn't a lack of friends. There was a lack of support system for new dads. And a lot of my closest friends, because it took us so long to get pregnant, had kids that were now 5 and 6, which is a very different support system when you're a new dad. They don't remember necessarily what it's like. And it wasn't like it was so easy to find new dads. So I found it just extremely isolating. And moms have all these support systems and ways for new moms to find support. And that didn't exist, which is what led me to start the podcast.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious if that's an interesting take that dads who have kids a little older, let's say 5 or older, I do agree. There's totally the recency effect, right? Where you just forget even like a year ago what happened. What were some of the experience unique to being a new dad that you found distinctly different than your friends who had kids, let's say 5 or older?
Well, as someone with, youngins, the experience from like 1 month to 2 months, like a 1 month old is very different from a 3 month old. And a 5 month old is very different from a 10 month old. But a 5 year old and a 7 year old, not that big of a difference in many ways. And I mean, okay, 5 and 7 is a tough one, but like 6 and 8, But I feel like at the end of the day, it's called the perinatal period. From the moment you learn you're expecting to that first year, the end of the first year. And that perinatal period is a transition, and it is a struggle, and it is hard. And I mean, I feel like you correct me if I'm wrong. You have a 2 year old and a 10 month year old, right? So
Yeah.
it's like you're out of it and now you're back in it, and I'm sure you can see, the major difference. And I feel like when someone's giving you advice with a 2 year old, all the nuance is missing to the struggles and the neuroses that you're experiencing. And sometimes you just want to know that you're not alone, but there's not a lot of support systems out there to help you to find other dads to talk to, And as of a few years ago, there were only moms groups, which is what led me to start Dad I'd Like to Friend, the DILF podcast, which is what led me to write my book. Um, and which is what led us to start the Dad Supporting Dads nonprofit. And we now have dads groups across the country. And we have, one of the largest dad networks in the country that allows dads to find support, which I think has been missing for far too long.
Yeah, I agree. We were talking before we jumped on, and you had asked, how connected I was socially to, other dads. And I was sharing, I do have a lot of connections. But what's interesting, a difference that I found that when my wife talks to her mom friends, they often talk about mom related struggles. But even though I was friends with other dads, we didn't talk about the dad struggles. And that's an interesting thing, and it kind of took me a while to realize like I have to be real and even be able to be aware and name the struggles. And especially, being moving from first time dad to second time dad, as you know as well, having a kid, like you can have all the perception of what you think it's like, but in the moment, you just cannot prepare for what it actually is. And that feels both overwhelming and isolating because you're simultaneously having to process and kind of place your new experiences while also needing to make decisions that almost require not previous experience, but some sort of understanding of what to do in a situation. And so that kind of overwhelm, in my experience, it comes from that
Am I going to
anxiety.
F them up if I make this?
Yeah, and in the moment, it's like, well, I don't have time to like do a research report on this. We just gonna find out, right? And like, so I think all those moments, and the sleep deprivation and just the constant and the communication with your partner, like how you're able to come into those situations. When I was dating my wife and we were assessing marriage, we knew we both wanted kids, but we didn't necessarily know, like, how do you assess this person's going to be a good partner, that you'll be a good partnership when you have kids. And of course, you can't foresee the future, but in my experience, that's another thing where you realize in real time, oh, we're like building three ships here as we're sailing, like raising the kid, figuring out how I'm processing it. That's two. And then three, like, what's the relationship dynamic with my partner that's coming?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. I feel like that's 10 different topics to discuss. I mean, first and foremost, there's the fact that as men, we're not often trained to go beneath the surface, and in order to build any connection, you have to go beneath the surface, right? It's the key to intimacy with your partner. It's the key to connection and friendship with others. And a lot of times we're trained as men to kind of have this barrier. I can't speak to everyone's father. My father has the biggest heart on the planet, and most people wouldn't know that because he doesn't wear it on his sleeve, right?
Mhm.
And he doesn't have a large support system. He has his best friend from elementary school, and he would be mad at me if I said this because he's so charismatic, and he retired as a dentist, and all of his patients loved him. But it was on a surface level, and most of the friendships came through my mom, and that is in many ways an older generation thing that the narrative has continued, even though certain things have changed. But many things have still stayed the same. And a lot of that is, again, because there is no support system in place for dads, let alone men, right? In our society, there's so many opportunities for women to meet one another, especially new moms. There's so much in place with moms groups. And unless, as we discussed on our pre call, unless you're in something like AA or very involved in in a religion and in your temple or your church, it is oftentimes very difficult to find communities. But that being said, I think that there's another amazing topic that you brought up with regards to the relationship dynamics and how they change with your partner. And how we hear all the time, there's no course to train you how to be a new parent. But the biggest problem I found, and one of the motivations for writing the book, is um, there's a lot of information out there, mostly geared towards women, that a lot of men read about how to raise your baby or how to support your wife. Because every book out there assumes that that you're a straight couple who, your wife gave birth. And I feel like with my wife, yes, my wife did give birth, but I was shocked at how many moms I met who had babies through surrogacy and adoption, whose experience was more similar to mine as a new dad than it was to my wife as a new mom. Add to that the fact that my wife and I are a complete role reversal. She's from Minnesota. She likes to keep conversations surface. It's hard to get her to, go vulnerable. She does with me, but she'd rather kind of, she likes hanging out with douchey dads, and talking sports. She does. And she's wonderful and hysterical. And I'm sure you would love her. She's one of the most likable people around. And if you listen on my podcast, when she comes on the podcast, the dads always like and agree with her, and the moms always agree with me when we get in, because we fight on the podcast. She comes on and we have arguments live on the podcast about things we're experiencing. And I think that it's just no longer the case where you can put these stereotypes on people and think that that is who they are in our modern society. But I feel like getting back to what you were mentioning about the kind of training ground, and when you're with your partner and you have this newborn baby and you don't really know what you're doing, I think that that's where you got to remember that connection is the key to everything in life.
Mm.
And so it's the key with your partner, which means allowing yourself. We talk about this in detail. One of the myths in the book is you'll never have sex again for new and expected dads. And that's all about connection. Why would anyone want to be intimate with you if they don't feel connected with you? And if they are overburdened. So if you carry your share of the load, then obviously they're going to feel more lightness and feel more connected. But that also goes with your kid. I think the best thing I ever learned just in the process of being with my son was allowing him to see me fail and being okay with it. And that's a great lesson for all your audience. I know you have younger men who are not dads, and skew to young men who are dads. And I think that the biggest lesson I've learned in my life is swing big and fail and fall on your face, because before kids, it allows you to learn immense lessons, which is helpful. It's harder to swing and fail as you get older, especially as a parent. But my advice is always fail in front of your kid. Let them see that you failed and got right back up. And I talk to my kid when I mess up. I tell him when I make a mistake. And I think it really bonds us because it makes him less scared to make mistakes. And I think it's a really beautiful thing when you have that connection. I mean, he's like one of my best friends. Uh, and I think that why this little guy is, one of my favorite people in the world is because he knows that I'm not perfect and he's okay with it and he still respects and loves me. And I know that he's not perfect. And at the end of the day, we're learning together.
You bring up something interesting as you're talking. It's like, I don't think we really feel the weight of how often you're with your kids, especially modern day. I think, as you mentioned, previous generations, the dad really wasn't around on average that much. I think I read some study, something insane like, the average dad now spends like 200% more time and with their kid. And part of that's like the work from home, and part of that is work life balance and benefits, and understanding the need for that and the desire for the dad to want to be involved. But I think what you're getting at in that failing, right, is breaking the shame of perfection, which a lot of us men have in general. We have it with, you know, our connection with other guys, our jobs, our health, and it certainly carries over to fatherhood. And I think that falsity of like, oh, I need to be perfect or have all my shit figured out comes from, something that you named in experience, which is the perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, which most people, including most dads, hear that and think that's a mom issue, hear postpartum depression, anxiety. But it's interesting that a lot of that fear of failure, that word fear is really a core emotion, and the sub emotion is anxiety, right? It's the fear of whatever unpredictable event unfolding from a psychological perspective. So I think when I realized that as a new dad, that like, oh, my fear that I'm not going to have enough sleep to function when I'm supposed to be back at work, or that my identity will be taken away if now I'm a dad, or I won't have any time to do the things that I want to do, whatever, all those things. That was like a subtle hum of anxiety that was like constantly day to day. And I think what you're getting at with the failing in front of your kids, and also just in general, is like letting go of the need for things to look a certain way, and being flexible and adaptive, and radically present to them.
Place that pressure gauge for everyone.
Mhm.
I really want to talk about what you just said, but I volunteer at my kids' school and I help with reading groups, and the kids come in and they read. And the biggest rule I had when I first came in was no one is allowed to correct anyone else. And there's always the know-it-all. Often the little one who raises her hand and she's like, "That word was incorrect. This is," or will cut you off to pronounce it correctly. And I did give it a she. A lot of times I found that it is um, a she, but it can be either gender. But at the end of the day, I was very pointed in letting everyone know that we are patient in this group and we allow people the chance to find their own way, and they will fumble when reading the word, but give them a second and then they will find their way to pronounce the word. I mean, they're little ones. But at the end of the day, what I found in doing that is the ones who always want to correct and feel like they know the answer all of a sudden felt less scared to admit when they didn't know something. I think just allowing the space for people to fumble not only gave the reader a chance to find their way and the confidence that they could get through the entire paragraph and read aloud, but also the people who were trying to correct and so eager to show that they knew the right answer, it gave them a freedom that they themselves were allowed to fail and struggle. And I found that the ones who always were eager to correct, those kids were then free to say, "Hey, I don't understand what this means," which was a really beautiful thing. It's become a really beautiful environment. And I think it's a very similar space for new parents. It's a very similar space for everyone on the planet. When you're allowed the space to not be perfect, it creates a vulnerability that allows for more connection. And that's, again, one of the biggest myths in the book is there's no room for mistakes as a parent. And I think that causes so many problems and so many issues between co parents. We talk a lot about redefining the term co-parent. Why should you be divorced or separated in order to be co-parents? You know, and I think that when you're talking about relationships and with your partner and kind of finding your way, I think that's something that has been a big issue in our society. We really pin men against women, and we also really pin moms against dads. And at the end of the day, I think we really all need to work as a team. And in order to do that, we need to not shame. We need to not do tit for tat. We need to find ways to connect and work together. But we can get into more detail as we continue through.
Yeah. So speaking in the myths, I'd be curious if you can break some of those down for us that you mentioned in the book, because, to your point, the powerful and sinister thing about belief is that whatever we believe, we deem as real and as normal. And while that's understandable, it's not necessarily helpful or even acceptable, right? And so I think I'm curious to hear some of these myths first, so that guys can name it, because I'm sure a lot of them run subconsciously as like inherited scripts of either that's what they saw modeled or heard from their parent, or like you're saying, in society, the different messages that we put out there, and even the way that a lot of dads are portrayed in the media and the lack of support, all those things kind of converge on contributing these myths. But yeah, curious if you can break some of these down to help a guy understand what are the beliefs I actually have around fatherhood, and how can I replace those myths with some truths.
Yeah, I mean, the first myth in the book is men have no interest in the upbringing of their children, which I found to be complete BS. And especially since, post COVID and 2020, this myth of dads not being actively engaged could not be further from the truth. It's a narrative from parents with kids that are, 10 years old and older. And if you go to the park, if you go to schools, dads are everywhere and so actively engaged. And I can tell you through our groups, we have over 3,000 dads throughout our WhatsApp communities, and they are actively engaged dads who are doing the work, who are putting in the time, who are supporting their partner, supporting, you know, eager to be the best that they can be. And when I say supporting the partner, I don't mean monetarily. I mean, some are, and some are stay-at-home dads. I mean, they are actively there and engaged in the role of parenting and co-parenting. Another big myth is you'll feel an instant bond with your baby. I don't know if you experienced this as a new parent, but that is the point of so much shame for so many dads. It's one of the things that leads to PMADs, which is something I experienced. Perinatal mood and anxiety disorders is something, it's an umbrella term that encompasses postpartum depression. But the problem is it also encompasses postpartum anxiety, which most people don't discuss. And that's a problem because a lot of women are labeled with postpartum depression, but anyone who's labeled with postpartum anxiety is kind of just dismissed. And both my wife and I had postpartum anxiety. I was having panic attacks and I was told, suck it up, dude. You didn't give birth. You don't deserve to struggle. And it's such a joke. And if I'm struggling, how can I help anyone else that I love? You know? And PMADS comes on for a variety of reasons that's not gender specific. Sleep deprivation affects any new parent. Change in identity. Who doesn't have a change in identity when they become a new parent? Change in relationship status. That is such a huge thing to learn how your relationship has changed, as you said, with your best friend, and partner. And now you're co-parents of this new kind of venture and trying to figure it out. Pre-existing conditions. For me, 5 years of trying to get pregnant. But for a lot of people, they have struggles prior. If your partner develops postpartum depression, your rate goes up exponentially of the partner experiencing PMADs. And again, women experience PMADs. Postpartum depression is part of PMADs. It just expands the umbrella to say it's not just postpartum depression. But it's absurd to think that it's hormones is the only piece of the puzzle. That is one piece. And there are many other reasons that people struggle. And that does not dismiss how much we need to support new moms, especially ones that gave birth, who are experiencing postpartum depression. It is very real. But there is a wider umbrella that we ignore. And how is someone supposed to support those new moms if they themselves are struggling?
I think it brings up a deeper truth that I've experienced getting into men's work, which is, society basically thinks, oh, if we minimize the value of men or dismiss them, then that will mitigate the issues that they have. And obviously, historically, the impact that they've had on society. When, to your point, It's actually our ability to integrate them and uplift them. And I think the biggest myth I'm seeing in men's work, and it seems like this is the same in supporting dads, is it's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it's not either or out of the scarcity mindset. Like, oh, if we uplift men, then that means it's at the cost of women or other genders or other expressions of that. And the truth is, it seems like this has been the reality in your work, right? Is that when we actually uplift men in a healthy way, not egotistical or not from a power point of view, but in a integrated, holistic, loving, like self-worth way. The irony is it actually makes everyone else around you better. And it collectively makes the environment and the world that we live in better and the home better and the family better, all these things. But it is interesting that I've spoken with a lot of guys that really do struggle with that self-worth piece, right? And even becoming a father, I feel like I'm a pretty capable person in general, but when I became a father, I was surprised how often I caught myself beating myself up and being like, "You just can't get it right. You're a selfish piece of shit." Like all you do is, you're reactive and you're not considerate. And one of the big shifts I had to have as a new dad was realizing, okay, it really is learning how can I consistently be more considerate about my wife because it's not top of mind as the person that didn't physically experience those things going through birth, as well as if you breastfeed or even bottle feed, the bond with the mother and kid in those early months and years really is so much more full on just somatically for the mom. So that was a big shift of like, wow, I really do need to be thinking my wife's physically more exhausted than me in a lot of ways, or she's not going to have the same capacities or interests that I have in what we want to do. But then that second one really is okay, knowing all these factors are true with the sleep deprivation and the anxiety and all those things. How can I start to take care of myself? And it wasn't until I said, I'm going to start going on walks. I'm going to not feel bad when I ask to go to the gym. I'm not going to feel bad when I go hang out with a friend and catch up and share with him. And all those things, to your point, it's kind of like a sit down, shut up mindset. And so it wasn't until a few months in that that really hit. And I thought, my God, like I really need to like own my worth, but not in a way that compromises someone else's.
Yeah, it's not an either or, which is one of the problems in our society. But one of the big things that we discuss in the book is something called freedom shifts. And it's this concept of every parent, especially, when you're co-parenting, but every parent on the planet deserves a freedom shift at least once a week. And that means that you get a time to, like you said, go work out, to go meet with a friend. But it only works if you also allow your co-parent that same opportunity, right? It can't be one parent taking freedom shifts. And that's a time period where they have no responsibilities on their shoulders, right? No parenting responsibilities. They're just allowed to take care of themselves and be selfish, which is not really selfish, taking care of yourself, But simultaneously, you have to allow your partner that same gift. And that's the way it works. And then you should also allow a third freedom shift every week for a date night, where you
Uh,
each kind of take no responsibility to be together. And that is, we say there's 7 days in a week. One night, I mean, this is all goes into detail in the book, but it's part of the you'll never sleep again and you'll never have sex again myths, where one of the keys is having a weekly business meeting. Get all the business out of the way, all the nuance, all the struggles that the issues that each of you is experiencing, the frustrations or the difficulties where one is drowning and needs help with something, right? Get that all of the out of the way one day a week. That leaves 6 other days of the week where you can maybe have a little more freedom. And one night, one takes a freedom shift. Another night, another takes a freedom shift. A third night, you take a date night and together. That doesn't mean you have to go out. You can put the kid to bed and play cards. You can massage each other. You can, hang out and relax. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing we say with freedom shifts, it's they have to be mind calming activities, not mind numbing. So that means
uh,
you're limiting things like alcohol or social media binging, right? Those are things that numb you, but don't necessarily get you to a new place. So mind calming has to do with connection. So you're going and connecting with a friend, you're working out, you're connecting with your body, connecting with the book. You know what I mean? There's different ways, and we go into a lot more detail, but in order to truly take advantage of a freedom shift, you need some form of connection. Because again, connection is what everything is about, you know? You just brought up about, um, moms having this bond with the baby. That comes up a lot in the you will feel an instant bond with your baby. And that's something I've interviewed a lot of moms through surrogacy and adoption and dads. And the fact is, and the research shows it in detail, that chapter, you will feel an instant bond with your baby, is all about the fact that bonding is formed from time put in. And this myth that moms have this instant bond is is slightly BS. It's that moms have a lot more opportunities to bond with their baby, especially when breastfeeding. And that's why I really encourage, even when moms breastfeed, that they allow some pumping so that dads have a time or their partners have time to do a feeding. Because two-thirds of new dads feel left out of the equation. And a big thing that seems to help is when dads get feeding time. And that's a really hard thing to do if a mom is breastfeeding. And that doesn't mean that breastfeeding isn't amazing and natural and that moms shouldn't do it if they're able to do it. But we also need to allow their partners a chance for some feeding opportunities because that is crucial bonding. And the more a dad is able to put time in, the more they're able to bond, the more they feel connection, the more they want to be actively engaged. And it creates a ripple effect of equality within the home. And how can you expect dads with a 3-year-old to feel connected and actively engaged when they've been kind of dismissed and not actively a part of it from the beginning? And so we need to find ways to form those bonds early on and take the weight off of birthing moms and make everyone feel a part of the equation.
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you said that because it also correlates with the general myth about men that they're less nurturing, right? Or that something I often hear in more traditional circles, right, is like, well, just basically the mom is primarily rearing them until they can play and roughhouse, quote unquote, and then the dad jumps in. And I think that points to the deeper truth that we know that men experience just as much, if not more, depth and variance of emotions. And we see this obviously
I
in
don't know
little
about more,
boys.
but that more than society says we do. I don't know if it's more than anyone else because that's an either or again, right?
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Yeah, I should specify in certain developmental stages, on average, they can tend to express more emotions in certain situations. But yes, it's not an all or nothing. And within that, you can look at that with a little boy who's very loving and hugging other boys and saying I love you and expressing his needs. And then you start to hit that 8 to 9, 10 range and the testosterone starts kicking in. A lot of boys start liking girls, and then you see this interesting shift where it becomes competition a bit with other boys instead of this kind of companionship of, hey, we're connecting, we're all friends, that kind of thing. And then that carries into adulthood, and then we see, wow, how many of us men are depriving our souls of nurturing ourselves because we've been conditioned to say, well, I'm not emotional, I don't need people, I don't need to express my emotions even if I were to have them. And then we see this particularly, it sounds like, played out in fatherhood in the same way, which is okay, then if you've had that mindset your whole life and you become a dad, why the hell would you change it? Right. Then you think it's the same thing. I can't be emotional. I can't bond with my kid. I can't express my emotions. I got to wait until they're 3 or 4. And then the best thing I have to offer them is like a coach style engagement, right? Which is I either play sports with them or tell them life's lessons that they need to hear. And that's
Yeah,
just not, it breaks down quickly.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that also that connection with other men and other people, there's this surface level connection that we need to go deeper and admit our faults, not only to our kids and to our partners, but to our friends. And without a lot of support systems in place, unfortunately, men are often left to explore these things on their own and feel a lot of shame and doubt, not realizing that everyone else is also experiencing them, you know?
Yeah, 100%. And speaking of, feeling isolated and not experiencing, let's say, a collective resonance, my wife recently overheard a group of women in their mid 30s say, and quote, dads don't have friends, the moms do, and they just make the husbands hang out. And I'm curious, one, we both know that's kind of true. So why do you think that's true? And two, maybe share you providing these alternatives with the dad supporting dads network, some stories you've heard about guys that maybe come into these groups with that mindset. And then once they partake, maybe they see things a little different.
I think it's actually not a lack of desire. It's the way the system has been set up in many ways. I think a lot of dads have a desire for connection, but it's scary, and also it is there's not a lot of opportunities for men to meet other men. And so that's one of the things we do when we do dads nights out across the country with a lot of our different dads groups. You know, you see people come in timidly, uh, and then sit down and start to talk, maybe a little more surface, and then we go a little deeper, and all of a sudden these bonds are formed. But you have to allow them the space for there to be a dad's night out, you know, and a lot of times there's not those opportunities. We're seeing more stroller clubs around, you know, that are popping up around the country. The problem is there's still surface conversations happening on this, right? Dads are walking and they're talking about the game while they're walking with their kid. That is good on a surface level, but they need to be talking about their struggles. We as men, each individual listening to this podcast needs to make a promise and an effort that they're going to talk to someone that they think is cool, a dad they'd like to friend, right? And basically admit a vulnerability to them and watch how it's rewarded with the other person admitting a vulnerability back. And bang, a connection and a bond is formed, right? And I don't think that moms are wrong that a lot of times we lean on them to help us form connections and to help us with social calendars. But I don't necessarily think that's always on men. I think that the systems have not been set up for men to be vulnerable, to meet other men. And there are systems set up for women and moms. But I think we're slowly changing. And I think we need to stop shaming about it and complaining about it and just find more opportunities to create more support systems. That's one thing that angers me a little about this conversation about the toxicity of boys and men. And we're working so much on helping boys and men, but there's no money or effort really being put into helping dads. And the thing is that if dads are the number one role model for a lot of these boys and men, why would we not put in more effort to support new dads? Right? And then the more vulnerable and emotionally evolved and supportive of their partners these new dads are, the happier homes we build and the more evolved and emotionally adept children we create. And I think that that is such an important thing that is missing right now. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, there's a few directions I'd like to head and hear your thoughts on. I mean, I think the first is how does a guy develop those social skills to begin to express and share what's going on and let's say effectively build social bonds with other dads. So that'd be the first one because I think a lot of guys to your point have that desire but then they easily get stopped by the fear of well, what am I going to say? What if I'm rejected? What if it sounds weird? What if I'm the only one that's struggling with this and then that now they won't want to hang out or talk to me? Or, I know they're interested in these generic topics, X, Y, and Z. Like, why not just stick to that? Because at least, we can have some sort of like general connection. So that'd be the first one I'd like to speak to, walking a dad through that. And then the second, to your point about those lack of resources, I mean, this is a big conversation right now, I think correlated to the manosphere and a lot of media going on is there's so much focus on how much power that these manfluencers have online, right? And the common thing that many people aren't talking about in this whole manosphere dynamic is it actually stems from a lot of dads struggling to know how to connect and how to be the one that their kid looks up to, and I'm wondering if we can talk about what that process may be like, because I think to your point, the more we support dads and how they can engage with their kids and how they can be in their lives, how they can have conversations, to me, that's a lot better than providing these kind of mass media theoretical messages that we think boys will listen to. When in short, we pay attention to the people closest to us.
Yeah, I'm going to flip the answers. The second question, with regards to the manosphere, there's a lot of douches out there. There's always been a lot of douches out there. And at the end of the day, they just have more opportunities now to be vocal. But I think that anyway, as you see, if you listen to the podcast, to the DILF Dad I'd Like to Friend podcast, you will hear dads you never expect breaking down in tears. And it's because, at a visceral level, we're all the same. All of us, everyone, even the douchiest of dudes. has shrapnel that's been thrown on them, through the years, and they just emotionally, their heart and everything that makes them feel they've been hurt. And at the end of the day, some people have more armor than others, but all that armor is that falsity and ego that we put out into the world. And that's the basis of the manosphere. But at the end of the day, every one of these people is human. And at the end of the day, I'm not saying they should be forgiven for their toxic energy they're putting out, but I am saying that we need to realize that that's not the immediate state for boys and men, right? And I see the danger more in this massive fear that every boy is like this. I think that that brings you to the first point. I think that the biggest thing we need to do is train men to be brave and emotionally vulnerable and to model that as dads, but also simultaneously for society to stop with this shaming and this, massive rejection of men versus women and men being the problem. We hear this so much, and I'm not saying that women aren't awesome, but it doesn't help anyone saying women rule the world and men suck, right? And at the end of the day, I think we need to teach this younger generation that it is scary to let down your guard. And at an early age, they need to hear it is scary to make a mistake while you're reading in front of your friends and to find your way and stumble until you find it. But if you allow them the space to stumble and find their way and read the word and continue through the paragraph, a confidence builds and they get more and more comfortable making mistakes and being vulnerable in front of others. And in answer to the question, like, how do we get dads to do that? We say, be brave and go out and jump off that ladder and admit a fault and admit something you struggle with. And I'll bet you will find that half the group, if not all the group, has a similar struggle. And you'll always get someone that's like, I didn't feel that. And that's fine. Maybe they did it. Maybe they're being douchey and they're scared and they don't want to admit it. But at the end of the day, you're gonna find someone else that struggles. And that's what's beautiful about a lot of these dads groups that we have. It's just men being vulnerable and admitting things they're struggling with. And tens of hundreds of people coming back and saying, me too. I'm also experiencing that. I'm also struggling. This is what I did. And a lot of people are quick to offer advice. And that's what we as men often do, which is in some ways a shame, you know. But at the end of the day, the only way we can combat that is by practicing being better listeners, by practicing being capable and available to admitting fault and being vulnerable, and by throwing ourselves out there and knowing that it's okay to make mistakes, and especially in front of our kids, but it's okay to admit faults. That's how we bond and connect, not just with our kid, but with other men, with our partners. And I think that's the most important thing to debunking and breaking this discussion of toxic masculinity.
I really couldn't agree more, and I'm really glad you said that because, I think it's not until you face that fear, which getting back to the worst thing, right? It's really asking underneath, am I lovable? Where I'm at for who I am I lovable? And until you share something that's less than ideal in a safe place with another man, then you really can't confront that myth and believe you can have real connection. Meanwhile, you know
I just want to say, Wes, one thing that's dangerous but true about what you said is you said in a safe space. I think that so many men, and to be honest, even my wife experiences this. We talked about it. We talked about the role reversal earlier, waiting for that safe space. You have to
Yes.
create that safe space. You can't just sit and wait. It'll never appear. The safe space is created by you being vulnerable and going on that ledge, and then someone else being vulnerable back. And now it's a safe space. You can't just think that you can walk into a room and some are safe, some are not. You have to create it.
Yeah, I think that's true in general. In my work as a therapist, the first question is, do I feel safe with myself for who I am in my own story, in my own body, all those things? And then what are the things I can express to replicate that in the other places I am? And that's actually true safety is not contingent on already having the prerequisites for safety. To your point, it's actually implementing and manifesting and expressing safety in that environment that makes it safe. And if we can go into that, going back to your courage point, and help guys be brave and say, hey, it's gonna feel uncomfortable, but uncomfortable is different than impossible. And also, uncomfortable is different than threatening. It's not necessarily threatening, but it's not until you stay in that space, make it safe yourself, and then you set the tone. And then once you do, I've also found that to be true. I use this analogy of like playing poker, different rounds, everyone puts a chip in. And the intimacy you build is basically, let's say you put a chip in and you look at me, it's just me saying, I'm not going to pass this time. I'm going to put in my chip. Then you're going to put in, and the ante keeps going up. And while the ante's going up, we're actually building that strong bond. But if no one ever takes that risk and puts it in and sets the pace, then, we're not going to get anywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is terrifying, but it is the only thing that will fix some of the mess we're in. And it is the only way to build these bonds. And it is the only way to truly connect with one another is for people to see all of us, the good and the bad. And that's the kind of kids we want to raise that are brave enough to show that. And in a society of Instagram fake perfection, it's one of the most important things we can do is admit that we don't have all the answers and admit when we're struggling and find out that we're very far from alone.
Mm. That's very well said. I'm curious, selfishly, I just want to ask this from one dad to another, and you're further along the journey and obviously have put together so many valuable resources based on your experience. Where I sit, what would you tell your younger self that was in my position those years ago, now that you've, gone through all the things you have?
I mean, this feels redundant from what we've been discussing, but I truly would stand by fail big. Don't be scared. Like I have this quote on my desk that's right under whenever I'm working, and it's in the book too. And it's ever tried, ever failed, fail again, fail better. And I think it's one of the most important quotes that I've ever found that kind of has guided my life in so many ways in that you got to swing big. And like they say, you failed if you never try. And at the end of the day, for a lot of people out there, you've got to attempt to be vulnerable in front of others and not be scared to make mistakes. And a lot of times it will not always work out beautifully. You will be vulnerable in front of a man and he will shut you down, right? And act like it's not something that he ever experienced. And that's his loss. And that sucks. But you have to put yourself out there again, right? And you have to be vulnerable with your partner, which can be scary at times to admit you don't know what you're doing. And you have to be vulnerable in front of your kid when you want to look like Superman and you're so scared that they're going to think you're not perfect. But these are the ways that we connect with people, and these are the ways we take the pressure gauge and release it. And these are the ways that we really not only build connections, but eliminate the shame that holds us back from living a big, bold, happy life.
So well said. And it just reminds me of how, the notion that there's never been a motivational speaker that's been inspiring because they've never failed, they've never struggled, they've never been through anything difficult. We're most drawn to the wounding, the sufferings, the setbacks, the failures, and not to idolize them in and of themselves, but who we become in them, who we become through them, and who we become after them. And I think what you're setting is as a really good example that's just real. It's living the life of a father, which, is so many mix of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But either way, and I'm biased because I'm already here, but it's worth doing. And for all the things that I've struggled with and gone through, and it seems like you've been the same, I would never have it any other way in a million years.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, tell us where we can find your work. I know you got some new things coming out. Yeah.
You could go to dadidliketofriend.com, and that's where you can find the podcast and the book. We're on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, everywhere with the new book. And you can learn more about the nonprofit and a lot of the resources we offer at dadsupportingdads.org. And proceeds from book sales go to benefit the nonprofit. And there's a lot of growing list of resources out there. And we're just trying to build support systems for dads that are very needed and hopefully will benefit everyone.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for the work that you're doing. We'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. I will read the book. And guys, until next time.